While most of the developing world shares a common history of having been colonized, colonialism took very different forms in different locations. Today I want to talk very briefly about several of these. Historically, we can identify two broad eras of colonization. The first era of colonization, the mercantile phase, lasted from approximately 1500 to approximately 1800. It was dominated by Spain and Portugal, with Britain and France playing important roles later on. Mercantile colonialism took place primarily in the Americas and the Pacific Islands. It was generally driven by the search for high-value, low-volume commodities like gold and spices that could easily be shipped back to Europe. Indeed, the purpose of colonial adventures during this period was often to fuel European rivalries and competition. However, as European economies gradually developed and industrialized, the nature of colonialism changed. By 1800, a new era of colonization was underway. This era, the era of industrial colonialism, differed from the previous era in several important ways. First, it was dominated by Britain and France, with other colonial powers playing significantly less important roles. Second, it took place primarily in Africa and Asia. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it was defined not by the search for gold, but by the drive for a steady supply of raw materials necessary to maintain industrial production in Europe. Thus, primary commodities like cotton and jute became important exports for colonial states. The Scramble for Africa illustrates the new face of industrial colonialism. Before 1880, 90% of Africa was independent. But by 1900, just 20 years later, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained uncolonized. Having divided Africa between them during the Berlin Conference of 1884, the European powers were anxious to extend their control across the continent. Technological advances, such as the development of the Maxim or machine gun, the discovery of quinine to fight malaria, and improvements in transportation technologies permitted Europeans to move further into Africa than they had historically been able. At the same time, military competition between Britain and France fueled each country's colonial expansion, while weaker European powers, such as Belgium, sought colonies in order to define themselves as important European states. Even when colonizing similar regions, the exact form of colonialism practiced by each colonial power looked very different. British colonialism frequently used a form of indirect rule, co-opting existing political authorities to expand their control over the colonies. In some colonies, like Kenya, Tanzania, Rhodesia, and South Africa, large numbers of British citizens settled. These colonies, usually referred to as settler colonies, faced particular challenges at independence because of relatively small numbers of white settlers often owned the vast majority of the country's most productive agricultural land and resources, frequently fueling racial animosity. Countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe have had a particularly difficult time addressing the unequal patterns of land ownership that resulted from settlement patterns that saw the best and most productive land owned by a relatively small group of white settlers, while the vast majority of blacks remained confined to so-called native areas, usually located in the most marginal environments. Regardless of the level of settlement, British colonialism was often justified by the idea of the white man's burden. This idea held that British colonization was morally necessary to bring progress and improvement and improve the plight of those who were colonized. Colonization, in other words, was seen as being a necessary part of bringing quote-unquote civilization to the regions of the world the British viewed as being uncivilized. The British usually viewed the lands it colonized as economically unproductive. The doctrine of res nullius held that land which was not being productively used was by definition unowned and unoccupied. This doctrine is closely related to John Locke's labor theory of property, according to which ownership rights are conveyed through the improving of land. But it was not simply a matter of working the land. The Native Americans in the pre-colonial United States clearly worked the land, growing maize, squash, and countless other vegetables in addition to hunting and foraging for wild crops. From the British perspective, however, the notion of improvement carried particular connotations. It was not enough to simply work the land. Improvement meant working the land for profit. From this perspective, then, Native American, African, and other colonial subjects were not seen as the rightful owners of the land because they had not used the land to generate commercial profit. Under the doctrine of res nullius and the labor theory of property, the British thus saw themselves as justified in their quest to dispossess indigenous communities around the world of their land and natural resources. French colonialism took a slightly different form. The French tended to view other existing political institutions, particularly those in the colonies, as inferior. France therefore often replaced existing institutions with new institutions loyal to the French government and administered by French nationals. This system, often referred to as direct rule, created post-colonial states with little infrastructure, limited capacity, and weak political authority. At the same time, the French maintained the notion of the civilizing mission, which held that while colonial societies were inferior, colonial subjects could become French by adopting the French language, educating themselves in French schools, and adopting French customs, traditions, and values. As we'll see in the next unit, critics of French colonialism argued that this system created a tension between the expressed sentiment of equity and the reality of inequality. For despite the theory of equality, no matter how good their French, no matter how devout they were to the Catholic Church, and no matter how deeply they embraced French culture and values, the colonial subject could never really become French. Not surprisingly, this tension often generated considerable resentment among colonial subjects. While the exact nature of colonialism differed between each power, all colonies were expected to be profitable, to generate labor and revenue, and to grow cash crops for export to Europe. The most egregious example of this was the Belgian Congo, where forced labor, the widespread use of amputations as punishment, and the free use of violence against the population decimated the local population while financing Belgian development. Belgium, like the other colonial powers, embraced a strongly paternalistic view of their rule, justifying violent repression of the local population through religious and ethical assertions that they had to, quote-unquote, teach Africans the value of hard work and save their souls. As we'll see in the next section, colonialism had a lasting impact on the effectiveness of the post-colonial state and the structure of the post-colonial economy, as well as on the psyche of the population itself.